Tonight, you are not going to count sheep. You are going to drift across oceans of time, to follow a rumor that refused to die. Atlantis. Not the cartoon kingdom with crystal towers, not the glossy ruins on a movie poster, but Atlantis as it first appeared. Not under the sea, but in the mind of an old philosopher in Athens, sitting between marble columns, speaking slowly to a small circle of students. His name was Plato. He did not claim to have seen Atlantis. He did not pretend to have a map. Instead, he framed it as a story handed down like a whisper, from Egyptian priests, to a lawgiver named Solon, to Solon's descendants, and finally, to him. A great island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia together. Rich, disciplined, powerful. A city built in rings of land and water, with walls that shone like metal under the sun, and ships gliding in perfect circles through man-made harbors. An empire so confident that it thought nothing in the world could stop it. And then, in a single day and night of misfortune, the island sank beneath the sea and disappeared. Was it ever real? Was it a memory of some forgotten civilization, or only a careful parable about pride and decline? For more than 2,000 years, philosophers, priests, explorers, mystics, and dreamers have taken turns answering that question. They saw Atlantis in Egypt, in the Americas, in the bottom of the Atlantic, in Sweden, in the sky, in the soul. Some said it was history. Some said it was symbol. Some said they could see Atlantis in visions, or hear it in the whispers of spirits and ancient masters. Tonight, you don't have to decide who is right. You don't have to argue with anyone. Your only task is to rest and let the story unfold around you, like waves on a very old sea. We will start in the cool shade of Plato's Academy, where Atlantis is just a story in a dialogue. Then we'll drift forward, through Aristotle's skepticism, through the silence of the Middle Ages, through the bright curiosity of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, into the crowded, anxious 19th century, where Atlantis becomes a global super-civilization in people's imagination, and finally into the dreamier landscapes of the occult and New Age, where Atlantis turns into a spiritual lesson about who we once were and who we might become. If you stay awake, you will hear the whole long journey. If you fall asleep, that's perfectly fine. The story will keep moving without you, sinking, rising, changing shape, just like Atlantis itself. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy, and let us begin. Chapter 1. Plato's Atlantis. A story, inside, a dialogue. We begin in Athens, around 360 BCE. The city is no longer at the height of its power. The great wars are over. The golden age of Pericles has passed. But in a quiet corner of the city, inside a school founded by Socrates' most famous student, something else is flourishing: philosophy. Plato's Academy is not a grand university. It is more like a garden of conversations, a place where people walk slowly under the trees, arguing about justice, about the soul, about the best possible way to live. On one of those imagined days, Plato begins a new dialogue called Timaeus. It is meant to explore the nature of the cosmos, the soul of the world, and the ideal state. But before the philosophical journey truly begins, Plato inserts a story, a kind of prelude. That story is Atlantis. He puts the tale into the mouth of a character named Critias. Critias says, "This is not my invention. I have received it from my grandfather, who heard it from Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens." And Solon, in turn, heard it from Egyptian priests. In the city of Sais, the priests, keepers of records far older than Greek history, tells Solon that the Greeks are like children, brilliant and energetic, but forgetful. Civilizations rise and fall, they say. Floods, fires, and catastrophes wipe away memory. Only in Egypt, where the Nile has spared them from some of these disasters, have certain records survived. Among those records, the story of a war between ancient Athens and a mighty power from beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a power called Atlantis. In Timaeus, Plato only sketches the outline. Atlantis is large, prosperous, and aggressive. It tries to dominate the Mediterranean. Ancient Athens, virtuous and well-ordered, defeats this empire. Later, a catastrophe sent by the gods sinks Atlantis beneath the sea. That is all for the moment. Plato then moves on to his real philosophical project, discussing the structure of the universe, the nature of the world's soul, and the blueprint of a just state. But the story does not disappear. In another dialogue, Critias, Plato returns to Atlantis, now with the obvious intention of painting it in detail. Here, he begins to describe the island itself, its kings, its laws, its wealth. He speaks of 10 royal lines, all descending from a union between Poseidon, god of the sea, and a mortal woman. He speaks of a city cut by concentric rings of land and water, carefully measured, carefully planned, as if a geometer had drawn it on the sea. He speaks of a plain, fertile and flat, cut with canals and irrigation ditches, producing harvest after harvest. He begins to show us Atlantis, not just as a myth, but as a fully imagined civilization. And then, Critias breaks off. The dialogue is unfinished. We never get the full ending from Plato's own pen. What survives is just enough for the story to live, just enough detail to make Atlantis feel almost real, just enough distance in time. Plato says these events happened 9,000 years before Solon, to place Atlantis in a misty, unreachable past. From this small fragment, the entire later ocean of speculation will rise. But in Plato's world, Atlantis is first and foremost a story inside a conversation, a tool inside a philosophy, a way to contrast an ideal, disciplined Athens with a rich, powerful, and ultimately corrupt empire that loses its soul before it loses its land. As you lie here, eyes heavy, imagine that first moment. A circle of students, a voice in the twilight of a long day, and the first mention of an island that will never let humanity go. Chapter 2. Rings of Stone and Sea, Walking Through the Imagined City. Close your eyes now, and walk, slowly, toward the capital of Atlantis, as Plato describes it. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out in the wide Atlantic, there is an island. On that island, a great plain. On that plain, a city. And at the heart of that city, rings. First you see water, then land, then water again, land again. A careful pattern of concentric circles, like ripples frozen in stone. From above, it would look like a target drawn onto the sea. From below, it would feel like you were descending, deeper and deeper, into the center of a secret. The outermost ring of water is a vast harbor. Great fleets of warships and merchant vessels rest there like sleeping animals. Their masts a forest of wood and rope. The tunnels between the rings are cut wide and deep, so that ships can pass all the way inward. Now imagine the walls. The outer wall is covered in brass, glowing warm and golden in the low sun. The next wall is coated in pale tin, catching light like a blade. The innermost wall is clad in orichalcum, a strange, reddish metal, second only to gold in value, its surface shining with an almost otherworldly gleam. In the morning, when the first light hits these metals, the whole city would blaze. From the deck of an approaching ship, Atlantis would not look like stone and mortar. It would look like a sunrise. Inside, the city is carefully planned. Bridges cross the water rings. Quays and docks line the inner harbors. Streets radiate outwards from the center, like spokes in a wheel. Everywhere there are signs of wealth. Temples, gymnasiums, race courses, and houses with baths fed by hot and cold springs. Follow the rings inward, and you reach the Sacred Heart. Here stands the Temple of Poseidon, 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, its height in proportion. The walls are silver, but the roof and the pinnacles are made of pure gold. Inside, a massive statue of Poseidon, driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, nearly touches the ceiling. Around him stand golden statues of the 10 original kings and their wives, frozen in metal, their faces turned forever toward their god. Outside the temple, a pillar of orichalcum holds the laws of Atlantis, engraved in sacred script. Here, every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings gather. They offer sacrifices. They sit in judgment. They renew their oaths, reminding themselves that their power comes with obligations to justice and to each other. Beyond the city, a great plain stretches out, long and flat, bounded by mountains. Canals run straight and geometric, allowing boats to move through fields and water to reach every corner. The soil is so rich that it yields 2 crops a year, one from the rains of winter, one from the careful irrigation of summer. From this abundance flows the wealth of Atlantis: grain, fruits, metals, timber, domesticated animals in great numbers. Here, Plato tells us, are all the resources that could support a vast population and a gigantic army. It is a dream of order, a dream of control, over water, over earth, over metal, over the very geometry of the landscape. But even in this vision, there is a hint of something fragile. An island surrounded by sea, a system that depends on balance. Rings of land and water, held in place by human will. As you let your breathing slow, you can almost hear the creak of ships in the harbor, the distant sound of hooves in the training grounds, the murmur of kings in the golden temple, reading laws from a shining pillar, and believing, perhaps, that nothing can ever change. Chapter 3. From Golden Souls to Heavy Hearts, Atlantis as a Moral Fable. Plato was not just a storyteller. He was a moralist, a designer of ideal cities in thought. When he spoke of Atlantis, he was never only building a fantasy. He was also building a warning. In the beginning of his tale, the people of Atlantis are noble. They carry within them, he says, a divine portion from Poseidon. This is his way of saying that their character is balanced, their desires moderated, their sense of justice strong. They are brave but not reckless, rich but not greedy, powerful but not yet corrupted by the love of power. They live according to laws. They treat their obligations seriously. They remember, at least for a time, that their prosperity is a gift, not a guarantee. In this early phase, Atlantis looks almost like the cities Plato describes in his dialogue Republic, places where each person plays the role, best suited to their nature, where wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice are in balance. But Plato is fascinated by cycles. He does not believe that human societies remain perfect forever. He watches his own Athens rise and fall in glory, winning against the Persians, then overreaching, then losing itself in civil strife and war. So in the Atlantis story, he lets time pass. Generation after generation, the divine element in the Atlanteans becomes diluted. They marry more and more. Outside the original sacred bloodline, the godly part of their nature weakens. The human part grows heavy. They begin to love wealth for its own sake. They begin to take pleasure in domination, in tribute, in seeing other nations bow. Their ships carry not only trade goods, but armies. Their rulers begin to expand, not because necessity demands it, but because pride whispers that they deserve more. To Plato, this is the real catastrophe. Long before the island sinks, the soul of Atlantis begins to crack. Once a civilization forgets the virtues that made it great, he suggests, its outer strength becomes an illusion. The temples may still shine. The walls may still gleam with metal. The fleets may still be terrifying. But inside, something subtle has shifted. When the Atlanteans move to conquer the lands inside the Mediterranean, Plato introduces a contrast. They meet an earlier Athens, a city that, in his story, is still poor in material things, but rich in virtue. This earlier Athens stands firm. Its citizens are disciplined, devoted, clear-minded. They defeat the Atlantean invasion, not with superior wealth, but with superior character. Only after this moral victory does the natural disaster arrive. Plato describes a great earthquake, floods, storms, and then the famous line, "Atlantis vanished into the sea," in a single day and night of misfortune. To a modern listener, it is tempting to focus on the disaster, to look for volcanoes and tsunamis. But to Plato, the true cause lay deeper, in the quiet, gradual erosion of the Atlanteans' inner life. In that sense, Atlantis is not just a unique legend. It is an example, a pattern. Any society that forgets why it exists, that measures itself only by wealth, size, and power, begins to walk the same path. As you lie here, you can let that idea float in the background of your mind, like a distant light under the water. Great empires do not only fall because the earth shakes or the sea rises. They also fall when they lose the invisible virtues that hold their world together. Chapter 4: Skeptics and Silence. When Atlantis was just a footnote. After Plato, you might expect Atlantis to spread through the ancient world like wildfire, but it doesn't. If you look at the major writers of Greece and Rome, you find something interesting. A lot of silence. Aristotle, Plato's most brilliant student, is said to have dismissed the story with a simple, cutting remark: "The one who invented it also destroyed it." To him, Atlantis was a teaching device, not a historical report. He was suspicious of myths, dressed up as facts. Where Plato was comfortable, using stories and images to carry philosophical truths, Aristotle preferred careful observation, logic, and verifiable history. Then there is Herodotus, the great traveler and storyteller, who wrote about Egypt, Persia, and lands as far as Scythia and India. He loved repeating local legends, recording temple records, describing rituals and rivers and strange customs. If anyone would have picked up a tale about a sunken empire beyond the West, You might think it would be him, but in his detailed histories, Atlantis never appears. Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War, was very interested in the early power of Athens, its alliances, its conflicts, its victories and defeats. He combed through traditions and stories to explain how the city rose and fell, yet he never mentions an ancient war with a Western island empire. Even when we move forward to Strabo, the Roman geographer, we find skepticism. Strabo had access to reports from sailors who had pushed beyond the familiar coasts into the Atlantic. They saw islands, currents, and weather patterns that Plato never knew. Strabo weighed Plato's claim that a huge island larger than Libya and Asia had once existed out there, and that muddy shallows now made the sea impassable. To Strabo, this simply did not match what explorers were finding. So he treated Atlantis as a poetic invention, not a lost continent. Roman historians and geographers followed a similar pattern. They loved Greek philosophy. They copied Plato. They adapted his political ideas. But when it came to Atlantis, they were mostly indifferent. The story did not become part of the official Roman imagination, the way, for example, the Trojan War did. Roman writers used Troy as a symbol of origins and destiny. Atlantis, by contrast, remained a curiosity in a dialogue that few could read in full. As time passed, the ancient world's libraries and academies faced fires, wars, and the slow erosion of neglect. Scrolls decayed. Manuscripts were lost. The fragile chain of copying broke in many places. In the Latin-speaking West, Plato's works became rare. Only partial translations of some dialogues survived. One Latin version of Timaeus stopped just before the detailed description of Atlantis, cutting off the very part that later readers would crave most. For centuries, this meant that in Western Europe, Plato's Atlantis was barely visible. It flickered only at the edges of scholarship, mentioned in passing, or not at all. In monasteries, monks copied what seemed most urgent: scripture, commentaries, practical texts. A philosophical story about a sunken island empire was not their priority. And so, for a long stretch of time, Atlantis was almost asleep. Not under the ocean, but under the sediment of history. A few lines in a dialogue that hardly anyone could read, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Chapter 5: Sacred Timelines. When Atlantis met biblical time. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and beyond, a new way of telling history came to dominate Europe. Time was no longer just a sequence of empires and wars. It became a story of creation, fall, redemption, and eventual judgment. In this framework, every event had to fit inside a sacred chronology. The age of the world was counted in thousands of years, based on genealogies. In the Hebrew Bible, from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to Christ, each link carefully measured. Now imagine a Christian scholar encountering Plato's Atlantis with its claim that the events took place 9,000 years before Solon. That would push Atlantis back to around 9,500 BCE, far older than the entire world, as calculated by many medieval theologians. This created a problem. Some early Christian thinkers, like Clement of Alexandria, took a flexible approach. They suggested that Egyptian priests may have used different systems for counting years and cycles, leading to inflated numbers. If the Egyptians were mistaken, perhaps Atlantis could be fitted into a biblical timeline after all, as some catastrophe before the flood, or as part of the mysterious civilizations hinted at in Genesis. Others, like Augustine of Hippo, were more cautious. Augustine admired Plato's philosophy, but insisted that scripture must remain the final authority. He treated stories like Atlantis primarily as moral or symbolic, useful perhaps as illustrations, but not to be trusted as literal prehistory that contradicted the sacred record. Meanwhile, the practical reality remained. Most Western scholars did not have full access to Plato's dialogues. They knew of him through Latin intermediaries, through mentions in other authors, through fragments and summaries. The vivid, detailed Atlantis of the Greek Critias was simply not available. In Eastern Christian lands, the situation was a little different. Greek texts remained more accessible. In the Byzantine Empire, some scholars there were more willing to weave non-biblical traditions into their universal histories. They speculated about ancient nations, about lost peoples, and about how all of them might relate to God's plan. But even in Byzantine writings, Atlantis did not become central. There were many other concerns: theological disputes, imperial politics, relations with Islam, the defense of Constantinople, a sunken island from a pagan dialogue, was not particularly urgent. So in the long Christian Middle Ages, Atlantis existed in a strange, half-lit space. It did not vanish completely. It was not forgotten, in the way some texts were, but it did not capture the medieval imagination, the way heaven, hell, or the flood did. People wondered about lost lands. They told stories of islands at the edge of the world, paradise, the Isles of the Blessed, the kingdom of Prester John, hidden somewhere far away. Yet these legends were shaped more by the Bible and by local folklore than by Plato. The Atlantis of later centuries, the Atlantis you know from movies, novels, and modern myths, simply did not exist yet. It was still only potential. Ink on old pages, waiting in silence for a new age of curiosity and a new way of reading the past. As you breathe out, you can imagine those centuries as a long, slow night for Plato's sunken island, not drowned in water, but drifting, almost forgotten, in the dark sea of medieval time. Chapter 6: Renaissance Dawn, when Atlantis met the New World. Then, slowly, the light changes. In the 14th and 15th centuries, European scholars begin to look backward with fresh hunger. They want the Greeks. They want the Romans. They want the original voices. This movement we call the Renaissance is not just about art and architecture. It is also about books. In 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. As heartbreaking as this is, for the Byzantine world, it has an unexpected effect in the West. Greek scholars, carrying precious manuscripts, flee to Italy and other parts of Europe. Among those manuscripts are works of Plato. In Florence, a man named Marsilio Ficino is asked by Cosimo de' Medici to translate Plato into Latin. Ficino devotes years of his life to this task. Around 1484, his translation of Plato's complete works is finished and printed. For the first time in many centuries, educated Europeans can read Timaeus and Critias in full. Atlantis emerges, not as a rumor, but as a whole story again. And almost at the same time, something else happens. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crosses the Atlantic Ocean. What he finds is not a drowned continent, but lands no European writer of Plato's time could have imagined. Islands and continents, full of complex societies, with their own histories, their own cities, their own gods. Within a few decades, reports begin to flow back to Europe about great cities on lakes, step pyramids, canal systems, and empires in the Americas. Some scholars and writers cannot help but connect the dots. Plato spoke of a mighty power beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now, beyond those same waters, there are indeed vast lands with advanced civilizations. Writers like Francisco López de Gomara and later historians of the Indies note the parallels. A city like Tenochtitlan, built on an island, crisscrossed by causeways and canals, reminds them of the ringed capital of Atlantis, the scale of American empires. Their wealth, their elaborate religious structures, seem to echo Plato's descriptions. Could it be, some wonder, that Plato preserved a distorted memory of these Western civilizations? Could Atlantis be some ancient echo of lands we are only just discovering? At the Medici court, where Plato is admired, almost as a spiritual authority, Atlantis also becomes a symbol. Renaissance thinkers feel themselves standing between a lost golden age and a new dawn. They see Atlantis as both a warning and a mirror, a story about how greatness can vanish and how fragile any civilization really is. Ficino does not treat Atlantis as literal history, but he reads it as a profound allegory about the rise and fall of cultures and about the tension between material power and spiritual wisdom. For the first time, Atlantis begins to step out of the narrow world of Greek philosophy and into the broader European imagination. It is no longer just a story told in a shaded courtyard in Athens. It is now a question, floating over maps and sea routes, whispered in the minds of explorers, missionaries, and scholars trying to piece together a new picture of the world. As night deepens around you, imagine a candlelit study in Florence, Plato open on the table, a fresh map of the Atlantic nearby, and someone leaning over both, wondering quietly, did something vast once stand here, between old world and new, and did the sea take it away? Chapter 7, Age of Reason, Sea of Theories. As Europe sails deeper into the so-called Age of Reason, Atlantis does not disappear. In some ways, it multiplies. The 17th and 18th centuries bring new standards of evidence, new scientific methods, and a growing confidence that the world can be understood through observation and logic. Instead of killing Atlantis, this spirit inspires a wave of new theories. In Sweden, a scholar named Olof Rudbeck proposes a bold idea. Atlantis, he says, was not in the Atlantic at all. It was Sweden. He points to Bronze Age burial mounds, ancient trade routes, and his own linguistic arguments, claiming that many classical names can be traced back to Nordic roots. He redraws the Pillars of Hercules on his own map, placing them in northern waters, arguing that ancient geographers were misunderstood. To Rudbeck, this is not just scholarship, it is national pride. If Sweden was Atlantis, then Swedish culture stands at the root of civilization. Other thinkers take different paths. French scholars like Philippe Bouache imagined sunken land masses in the North Atlantic, inspired by emerging ideas about changing sea levels and the shape of the ocean floor. They draw maps with hypothetical islands and ridges that might have once been dry land. The developing science of geology adds fuel to the fire. Discoveries of marine fossils high in the mountains, evidence that seas have moved and continents have shifted, make it easier to believe that large lands could have disappeared. At the same time, the Enlightenment's critical spirit produces hard skeptics. Voltaire, sharp-tongued and relentless, subjects Atlantis to rational analysis. He points out the chronological problems, the lack of independent sources, and the tendency of humans to embrace grand stories with little proof. Historians like Edward Gibbon refine methods of source criticism, comparing documents, evaluating biases, testing claims against evidence. Applied to Atlantis, these methods highlight how isolated Plato's account really is. Explorers cross not just the Atlantic, but the Pacific. They meet sophisticated island cultures that demonstrate how advanced societies can thrive on small pieces of land, scattered across vast oceans. This makes some aspects of Atlantis more plausible, but also underscores how little actual trace there is of a lost supercontinent. By the late 18th century, Atlantis has become something of a testing ground for how people think. For some, it is a genuine mystery to be solved with new science. For others, it is a perfect example of how myth seduces reason. In drawing rooms and lecture halls, people argue, is Plato preserving the memory of a real catastrophe, or is he simply using a brilliantly constructed metaphor to talk about politics, virtue, and fate? As your eyelids grow heavier, you can imagine those debates, not as sharp confrontations, but as distant waves, arguments rising and fading, opinions forming and dissolving, all around a story that refuses either to be fully proved or fully dismissed. Chapter 8: Ignatius Donnelly and the Birth of a Super Civilization. In the 19th century, Atlantis makes a dramatic return, not in academic journals, but in the popular imagination. The world is changing fast. Steam engines, telegraphs, railways, and global empires compress distance, connect continents, and unsettle old certainties. Archaeologists uncover the ruins of ancient cities in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. Darwin's theory of evolution forces people to rethink the age and development of life. New discoveries arrive so quickly that the past begins to feel both larger and less stable. Into this atmosphere steps Ignatius Donnelly, a former U.S. congressman from Minnesota. Donnelly is not a trained archaeologist. He is, however, a skilled communicator with a taste for grand theories. In 1882, he publishes Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book is thick, packed with citations, maps, and charts. To the general reader, it looks like serious scholarship. To many specialists, it looks like ambitious speculation. Donnelly's central idea is simple and very appealing. Atlantis was real. It was the cradle of all advanced civilizations. When it sank, in a catastrophe he connects with global flood myths. Its survivors scattered to Egypt, to the Americas, to Europe and beyond, carrying with them knowledge, technology, and religious ideas. He draws lines between Egyptian pyramids and Mesoamerican temples, noting similarities in shape and orientation. He collects flood stories from cultures around the world, treating them as fragments of a single memory of Atlantis' destruction. He points to similarities in myths of gods arriving from the sea, in symbols, in building styles, in supposed linguistic roots. Again and again, he concludes, these parallels cannot be coincidence. They must come from a shared Atlantean origin. To modern scholars, the flaws in this method are clear. Donnelly often ignores differences, plays loosely with dates, and stretches linguistic comparisons far beyond what careful philology allows. He confuses looks similar with must be related, and treats myths as if they were travel diaries. But to the reading public of his time, his theory is intoxicating. Here is a story that explains everything at once. Why pyramids appear on both sides of the world. Why flood myths are everywhere. Why so many cultures seem to share fragments of symbol and story. Here is a lost continent that links the Bible, classical mythology, and modern discoveries into one grand narrative. Donnelly's book is a hit. It goes through multiple editions. It influences writers, lecturers, and later generations of alternative historians. His version of Atlantis, a highly advanced global mother civilization, becomes the template for many stories that follow. From this point on, Atlantis is no longer just Plato's cautionary tale about moral decline. It is also a stage on which people project their hopes and fears about progress, technology, and the fragility of civilization. To Victorians, looking at their own mighty empires and rapid inventions, the idea of a brilliant world swept away overnight is both terrifying and strangely familiar. As you listen, you may notice how easily the human mind accepts a story that feels complete, even when the evidence is thin. Atlantis, in Donnelly's hands, becomes less a place than a mirror, reflecting the 19th century's belief that everything must have a single, grand, unifying explanation, even if we have to invent it. Chapter 9: Esoteric Atlantis, Root Races and Crystal Cities. If Donnelly gave Atlantis a global historical role, another movement would give it a cosmic one. In the late 19th century, as interest in spiritualism, Eastern religions, and occult traditions grows, a Russian aristocrat turned mystic teacher enters the scene. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky co-founds the Theosophical Society and publishes The Secret Doctrine in 1888. In this vast, complex work, she weaves together Hindu and Buddhist ideas, Western esotericism, biblical motifs, and her own claimed access to hidden wisdom. Atlantis, in her system, is no longer just a lost land. It is the stage for an entire root race in human evolution, the fourth in a series of 7. According to Theosophy, humanity has passed through enormous cycles. Each root race inhabits a different continent and state of being. Before Atlantis, there was Lemuria, a more etheric humanity, on a different kind of earth. The Atlanteans, she says, were giants compared to us, with powerful psychic abilities. They communicated telepathically. They controlled energies that modern science does not yet recognize. Their technologies were driven by subtle forces, channeled through crystals and sound, rather than steam and electricity. Their cities, in the theosophical imagination, are made of crystalline materials, geometry, and light. Their temples are instruments for tuning consciousness, not just places of worship. But as with Plato, the story is not just about greatness. It is also about decline. Over long ages, Blavatsky says, the Atlanteans misused their powers. They turned their psychic abilities toward domination. They practiced black magic, seeking control and pleasure over balance and service. The continent's eventual destruction, in floods and earthquakes, becomes, in this telling, not just a geological accident, but the karmic result of spiritual corruption. Some Atlanteans, she claims, escaped and carried fragments of their wisdom to new centers, founding mystery schools in Egypt, India, Tibet, and elsewhere. Others carried their distorted practices, seeding later traditions of dark magic and manipulation. Theosophies Atlantis is halfway between myth and doctrine. It's not meant to be confirmed by digging in the seafloor. It's presented as knowledge from higher planes, accessed through clairvoyance, and contact with hidden masters. For believers, this gives the story a powerful authority. For skeptics, it places Atlantis even further outside the realm of testable history. Yet the emotional appeal is strong. Atlantis here is a story about the rise and fall of consciousness itself, about how high we might climb and how low we might fall, depending on how we use what we are given. As you drift towards sleep, you may notice how comforting it can be to imagine that our strange longings, our flashes of intuition, our fascination with lost wisdom might be echoes from some deep, forgotten chapter of the human soul. In that sense, Theosophies Atlantis is less about the ocean and more about an inner sea, a memory of power and loss, lapping quietly at the edges of the mind. Chapter 10: New Age Currents, Steiner, Casey, and Returning Souls. In the early 20th century, Atlantis continues its transformation, not in universities, but in spiritual circles. Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian philosopher and mystic, builds upon some theosophical ideas, but reshapes them within his own system. Called anthroposophy, Steiner speaks of Atlantis as a real phase in human evolution, but emphasizes that consciousness itself was different then. Atlantean humans, he says, lived in a more dreamlike state. They did not separate inner and outer worlds as sharply as we do. They experienced nature as alive and permeated with spiritual beings. Their technology, to use a modern word, was more like a collaboration with nature's forces than an attempt to dominate them. They influenced plant growth, weather, and materials through will and imagination, under the guidance of advanced spiritual teachers. Their machines, if we dare call them that, were extensions of human intention, rather than separate, whirring contraptions of metal. For Steiner, Atlantis ends because this kind of consciousness can no longer support the next step of evolution: clear, self-aware thinking, individual freedom, and moral responsibility. The catastrophe is not only external, it is a necessary transition from a dreamlike unity with the spiritual world to the waking separateness that characterizes our time. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, another figure is giving Atlantis a different kind of life. Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, enters trance states and gives readings on health, past lives, and spiritual matters. Between the 1,920 seconds and 1,940 seconds, Cayce's readings mention Atlantis hundreds of times. He describes it as a technologically advanced civilization stretching back as far as 200,000 BCE. Atlanteans use enormous crystals to harness energy for transportation, communication, and healing. He speaks of three major destructions, the last around 10,500 BCE, which finally sinks the remaining land. Cayce's Atlantis is a battleground between two groups, the children of the law of one, who seek harmony and spiritual growth, and the sons of Belial, who desire power and exploitation. Their conflict over the use of crystal energy and other technologies mirrors, in mythic form, our own anxieties about how we use science and power. Cayce also claims that many souls who once lived in Atlantis are incarnating again. In the 20th century, he suggests that people drawn to technology, healing, or spiritual searching may be reliving old Atlantean patterns, either to repeat mistakes or to finally correct them. He even predicts that remnants of Atlantean records will be discovered under the Sphinx in Egypt or beneath the waters near the Bahamas. These predictions have fueled decades of expeditions, books, and documentaries. Whether one believes them or not, they show how deeply Atlantis has migrated from a philosophical text into personal identity, into the stories people tell about who they were and why they feel strangely out of place. In the modern world, as you inhale softly, you can sense how these New Age visions turn Atlantis into a kind of mirror. If you feel torn between technology and intuition, between a longing for simplicity and a fascination with power, the myth whispers, perhaps you were there when it all went wrong. Perhaps you are here now to do it better. It is a soothing thought, even if it cannot be proven, that our struggles have deep roots, and that by choosing wisely, we might heal not only ourselves, but very old wounds carried across lifetimes. Chapter 11: Modern Science and the Empty Sea. While spiritual movements shape Atlantis in one direction, scientific disciplines shape it in another. Throughout the 20th century, archaeology becomes ever more precise. Excavations adopt systematic methods. Stratigraphy, careful dating of layers, builds timelines of human activity. Radiocarbon dating arrives in the mid-20th century, allowing organic remains to be dated with remarkable accuracy. Underwater archaeology develops, probing shipwrecks, harbors, and drowned coastlines. Geology, with its study of plate tectonics, proves that continents move very slowly over millions of years, not by suddenly sinking whole in a single night. Studies of sea level changes after the last ice age show that coastlines did shift dramatically, and that some coastal settlements were indeed drowned by rising waters. All of this provides context, real, dramatic stories of destruction and loss. We discover sunken towns, ancient harbors, and flood-damaged ruins. One famous example is Thera, the island now called Santorini, where a massive volcanic eruption, around 1600 BCE, devastated the Minoan civilization. Some scholars suggest that memories of this disaster might have contributed to Plato's vision of a world rocked by the sea. Yet, despite all this, no evidence emerges for a vast, technologically advanced continent in the middle of the Atlantic. Around 10,000 BCE, the mid-ocean ridge is mapped and studied. The geology of the Atlantic floor shows no trace of a drowned landmass, like the one Donnelly imagined. Known civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, the Americas, are traced back through their material remains. They have roots in local developments, in migrations and contacts. We can increasingly follow, through artifacts and DNA, the idea of Atlantis as the single source of all civilization no longer fits the evidence. And yet, the myth does not simply vanish. Professional archaeologists may set it aside as a useful example of how not to do history, but popular books, films, and esoteric teachings keep it very much alive. Some researchers propose more modest identifications that Atlantis might be a poetic memory of a specific island culture or a composite of several disasters. Others, influenced by geology, talk about ancient shorelines, megalakes, and drowned river valleys, reminding us that much of human prehistory still lies under the sea. Modern science, in this way, does two things at once. It shows that the grand, literal Atlantis of Donnelly and Casey is extremely unlikely, if not impossible, but it also shows that Earth's history is full of real cataclysms, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, meteors, and rapid climate changes that have reshaped landscapes and erased entire ways of life. So while the specific myth of Atlantis remains unsupported, the deeper intuition that civilizations are fragile, that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as it seems, is scientifically true. As you breathe out slowly, you may feel a quiet humility. We stand on a thin crust, above forces we barely control. We build cities on coasts, and on fault lines, we trace our histories, in stone and paper, knowing that fire, water, and time can take them away. Plato did not need radiocarbon dating to understand that. He could see it in the rise and fall of the cities around him. Atlantis, in this modern light, becomes less a map and more a reminder that the world changes, that no empire is permanent, and that sometimes the only trace that remains is a story someone thought to write down. Chapter 12. Why Atlantis Still Floats in Our Dreams. After more than 2,000 years, you might expect Atlantis to have either been proven or forgotten. But here you are, lying in the dark, listening to its story. As you drift towards sleep, why? Part of the answer is that Atlantis sits at a perfect crossroads of human longing. We long for a golden age, a time when things were better, higher, more harmonious, a time when knowledge was deeper, when we were closer to the gods, to nature, to each other. Atlantis gives that longing a shape, a shining city in rings of stone and sea, with advanced knowledge and great beauty. We also fear that what we have built can disappear. Wars, disasters, economic collapse, climate change. We know, deep down, that nothing is guaranteed. Atlantis gives that fear a narrative, a day and night of misfortune, the sea rising, the land sinking, a proud empire gone. We resist the idea that history is just one thing after another, disconnected and random. We prefer patterns, hidden links, great unifying explanations. Atlantis offers a grand pattern, a single source. For many myths, many symbols, many technologies, even if that pattern is more poetic than factual. And finally, we sense in ourselves both greatness and danger. We know we can build miracles, skyscrapers, satellites, global networks of information. We also know we can misuse all of it, harming each other and the planet. Atlantis becomes a mirror for that double nature. It shows us a civilization that reached high and fell hard, not only because the earth shook, but because something inside slipped out of balance. So, even when science sets aside the literal continent, the myth remains valuable. For the philosopher, Atlantis is a parable about virtue and corruption. For the historian, it is a cautionary tale about how easily stories can be mistaken for data. For the mystic, it is a memory of lost capacities and spiritual crises. For the storyteller, it is an endlessly deep well of images, gleaming metals, sacred laws on a shining pillar, temples of gold and silver, crystals humming with power, ships disappearing into a storm. And for you, here, now, it is a gentle path for the mind to walk. As the body lets go, you have traveled from Plato's quiet academy, through centuries of debate, through Renaissance curiosity, Victorian speculation, occult visions, and modern skepticism. You have seen Atlantis as a city, a continent, a civilization, a spiritual stage, a metaphor, a warning, and a dream. Perhaps, in the end, that is its true nature. Not a place on a map, but a story that adapts to whatever age tells it. Tonight, let it simply be a soft, slow current, carrying you farther from the shore of waking concerns. The ships are back in harbor. The shining walls are dark. The great crystal is quiet. The philosophers have gone home. The mystics have closed their eyes. Only the sea remains, breathing in long, slow waves, holding all these versions of Atlantis. Somewhere in its depth, you do not need to solve the mystery. You only need to rest here, on the surface of the story, and let yourself sink into sleep.